Hello, welcome to this short program that we're calling The Gift of a New School Year. It's being brought to you by the Society for the Prevention of Teen Suicide with support from the Kentucky Department for Behavioral Health, Developmental, and Intellectual Disabilities. Our goal is to reinforce your skills as parents and guardians, especially as you approach the return to school this year. Part of the reason for choosing this topic is that we've been concerned that there's so much misinformation out there in the media about the negative impact on your kids of both COVID and the changed school protocols of last year, that we wanted to remind you, you can't believe everything you see or hear. We want to give you some strategies for figuring out what the potential issues could be for your child, or if maybe there's none. But we want to give you some information to help you make that determination with knowledge instead of rumor. I keep saying we, don't I? Let's talk about who we are. I am Maureen Underwood. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've actually worked with the state of Kentucky for several years on programs related to the wellness of kids and families. Especially since COVID, I've developed a fair number of national programs that focus on the positive aspects of coping in what has been an undeniably stressful situation. And I'd like to introduce you to our other co-trainer for today, Matt Strobel. Matt?
Thanks, Maureen. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Strobel, and I'm a school and clinical psychologist who works with children, families, and organizations. Since the start of the pandemic, I've been working tirelessly to support the community around me, as well as further. As hard as that job has really been, nothing has really compared to being the dad of 3 young children throughout all of this. I really hope to work with everyone today and that everyone can leave with a better understanding of how to support each other and our children. So let's go ahead and get started with one of the most important topics that we face, self-care. If you look at this picture, it may remind you of the last time you were on an airplane, which could be a while. I know it is for me. And even if you do remember the last time you're on a plane, does anyone even pay attention when the people are talking about the safety, or are we just always worried about when the snack cart will be there? So let's really think about what this says. This slide talks about putting the mask on yourself before helping anyone else. That's exactly what we're talking about when we talk about self-care. We need to be able to support ourselves before we can support anyone else. So let's talk about what that looks like. Right now, I think it's easy to argue that self-care is more important now more than ever because of the challenges that we're facing and how quickly those challenges are changing, just like Maureen was talking about with all the misinformation. We're all learning, so it's really important to be patient with ourselves and others, especially when we feel like our fuse is shortened. One of my favorite books is The 4 Agreements, and one of the agreements in that book is to always do your best. And while that's a great idea in theory, the real important part of that thought is that your best always changes. Your best one day may not be your best the next day, and that may be not the same the next minute. Just always strive to do the best you can with what you have in front of you. We also can look for support for self-care from friends, family members, our children's school, and even social media. There is a caution here, though, that social media often portrays an idealistic view of the world and often leaves out all the tough times. So just take that with a grain of salt. Lastly, it's really important that we take care of our big 3, sleep, exercise, and nutrition, which we're going to get into later. But now I'd like to turn the presentation back to Maureen, who's going to speak more on the process of adjustment.
Thanks, Matt. We all spent the whole last year adjusting from the life we always knew to a life that none of us were really prepared for. And one of the things we know from both science and our life experiences is that adjusting to something new, what we always call making a transition, requires both physical and emotional energy. That's especially true when we're in a situation where the outcome is somewhat unknown. Being in an uncertain space where we're not exactly sure what the outcome is going to be or what's happening next, it often creates stress for us. And as you probably know, stress robs our brain of biochemicals and the hormones it needs to work efficiently and really to problem solve. And the truth is, life right now does remain unsettled. There's that talk about vaccines and COVID variants, and Even though they may not be in the front of your mind, they'll be somewhere in the back, like those apps that drain the batteries from your phone or your PC. On top of that, you've got the usual back to school stuff to think about. Those concrete, practical things like pencils and notepads and shoes and gym clothes. And they really take up a lot of space in your brain, especially if you have more than one kid. So there's not a lot of room for anything else. And you may be feeling exhausted. And if you're not feeling exhausted already, you're kind of anticipating that's going to happen. Dealing with any kind of list in our brain takes mental energy. And because we have to factor in that whole idea of uncertainty as we start this school year, it can be helpful to figure out in advance what are the things you have to figure out how to manage, and include in that giving yourself a break. So let's start with you. And one of the breaks you can give yourself is to give yourself credit for just getting through the last year. If you're like most people, it's pretty easy to list all the challenges you had to deal with last year. My list could be 3 pages long, and as much as I would hate to admit it, I keep adding things every day. It's an easy topic of conversation for almost everyone I meet, everyone I talk to, even in lines at the supermarket. But how often do we stop to think about the things we learned about ourselves? What helped us get through? The changes we made in our lives, perhaps, that made things just a little bit easier. Think about that. What comes to your mind? Here's how some other parents and guardians have answered that question about what got them through the last year. Letting go of the need to be perfect, accepting it was okay to change standards, and usually that meant lowering standards, not making your standards higher. Taking naps, you didn't have to be a grandparent to take a nap. Really some positive things about kids. People talked about understanding their kids better because they'd spent more time with them, and realizing that their kids were really more capable of things than they had given them credit for. Kind of going back to letting go of that need to be perfect, also kind of letting go of some of the things in your life that really weren't necessary. And the value that having those Zoom connections had, although they weren't quite as good as in person. How would you answer this question? Let yourself think about it, because if you choose to see it this way, these are some of the gifts you gave yourself over the last year. It's a way of organizing your COVID experience with some degree of optimism. It does not change the magnitude of loss that some of you may have suffered. You're just looking at that experience from a different perspective. And once you figure that out for yourselves, why don't you ask your kids that question? So, how about asking your kids, what helped you get through the last year, rather than what was hard about last year? You accomplish a couple of things by asking this question. Just by simply asking it that way, you're very clear that they have made it through a very difficult time in their lives, and truly in the life of our entire country. Secondly, you demonstrate that there can be more than one way to think about the same events. Most often, our focus does tend to be on that negative. The positive is always there. We just don't pay a lot of attention to it. So by helping your child shift their focus, and especially using such a current dramatic event to do it, you can make it easier for them to grasp the concept of perspective. Saying something like, boy, I know we all felt the same way at the beginning of this pandemic when we learned there'd be virtual school. I mean, how in the world were we going to manage it? I know we had those conversations, but we did. We made it through. And even though it wasn't always easy, I mean, there were some hard times. There were good times too. And we did the best we could, and we learned a lot along the way. If your child seems stuck, share some of the observations you've had about them. For example, when you had trouble with your computer, and boy, I know there were times you had trouble, what you did was you took a break, and then you came back to it and you figured it out. I didn't realize you had such a funny sense of humor. Some of the things that you said sometimes really, really made me laugh. Or, Who knew you could be so creative with using peanut butter? Yeah, you get the idea. If your child is young and less verbal, ask them to draw a picture and you draw one too, and take turns explaining one coping skill that maybe you didn't even know you had before the pandemic. As you know, being able to shift perspective is one of those critical social emotional learning skills that are taught in school. So now let's look ahead. We just look back, let's look ahead. What does the next school year look like to you? And I want you to look at this picture first because we chose this very intentionally. Have you ever had that feeling when you left the grocery store when you're trying to be really efficient by carrying all your bags, that maybe you should have taken a cart instead or made your bags less heavy so you wouldn't be worried that the bottom is literally going to fall out and there'd be sort of a big mess? Yeah. Most of us can sense when something like that's going to happen and it's kind of out of our control. Although, if we thought about it ahead of time, we could have avoided the situation and have it not turn out so bad. Thinking ahead about what concerns you about the next school year is a little like packing those grocery bags and anticipating what might make them a little too heavy for you. What can you anticipate about the next school year that may create some problems for you? As it says on this slide, if you can begin to anticipate, you can problem solve before the situation stares you in your face. And the clearer you are about what your concerns are, the less energy you waste on things that don't matter. And just remember, you don't have a lot of energy. If you acknowledge your worries, it doesn't take away from the accomplishments that you had in the last year. They're still there. And you can figure out some ways to get some help. So let's take a look at what some parents have said in national surveys about the worries they have about the next school year. They've talked about their kids missing out on those social opportunities and extracurricular activities. There's a lot of concern about hands-on and in-person learning, especially for kids who did well virtually, how to balance homeschool and work for parents. The mental health needs of kids came out at the top of almost everybody's list. Worries about the safety of students and school staff, and then not really kind of knowing what your kid is going to need to be successful. So we can't help you out with a lot of those, but we can answer that last question for you about what your kids may need to be successful. So let's talk briefly, and maybe these look like some of your children. I know they kind of reminded me of my grandchildren, about what do they need to be a success next year. First of all, kids need to know what their schedule is going to be as best they can. Some districts are worried about the fact that they may have to sort of resort back to remote learning or hybrid. So it's important to talk about that with your kids. Talking about it does not mean it's going to happen. It just makes it easier to prepare for. What are your rules going to be at home? How have they changed from the last school year and even from what rules you had over the summer? How about bedtimes, computer times, homework times? Be clear about what you expect. Set up a time initially so that you can kind of talk about that transition back to school and ask your kids questions you have a better chance of getting an answer to rather than how was your day? And those are, what we talk about is open-ended questions. What was something funny that happened today? Did you see something kind at school? What's one thing in school that's different from the way it was last year? It shows you're interested. If you're worried that your kids are struggling academically, get them help as soon as you can. Don't wait. Catch it in the beginning before it gets past that point of no return. That becomes frustrating for everybody. Be open to your kids' concerns about the school safety rules. And if they're a little worried or anxious about some of the protocols, ask them what they think their school could do to make them feel safe. You're giving them a little power in this equation, and often they have great ideas. Those extracurricular activities are so important. I know that they can drain your time and your schedule, but it's so important for your kids to stay connected. And finally, it's really important especially for your younger kids, to identify a trusted adult they have at school. So if something kind of goes sideways, there's somebody they can go to. So what's the bottom line with all of this? Well, the deal is that there's still adjustment coming for all of us. But if you use that lens of what is this teaching me? Or what can I learn about myself? you're looking at it from maybe a positive, but at least a neutral slant. And it takes a lot less energy, as we said before, to have a neutral perspective than a negative perspective. As we said, try to anticipate those challenges for you and your kids and problem solve ahead of time. Um, and again, you want to sort of see this as a pattern for success and not failure. Just the word you use can make just an amazing difference in how you get through it. And I'm going to turn this back to Matt because he has a lot more specific suggestions about that success part. Matt?
Thanks, Maureen. Those are some really great tips. And let's get into some more to help these parents out as best as we can. As we all return back to whatever the new normal is going to be for school this year, please keep in mind that it is an adjustment and think back to the slide about giving yourself that space to do your best when you can. We spoke a little bit about self-care earlier, and we're going to get into that a little bit more in a few minutes. But we also will need to talk about working on increasing our protective factors, which will serve as a buffer for any challenges that come our way, as well as increasing our children's protective factors. We will also talk about being on the lookout for warning signs of when something goes wrong, just like Maureen just mentioned. And we're going to talk about building a strong foundation so that we can all work together to help support each other. Let's get into some of the new challenges that we're going to face as we return to school. Lots of people are reporting that they're worried about being behind in schoolwork. That's coming from kids, teachers, administrators, everyone really. I like to remind my friends and clients that we're all in the same boat. We're all in this together, and that we're all going to work on overcoming those challenges as well. Lots of people have reported that they've lost their friends and that it's going to be hard to reestablish relationships now that we get back to in-person learning. And they've kind of felt more isolated than they were in the past. Of course they have. We're all staring at screens all day. So it's going to be a little bit of a learning curve again to meet that first person and have a real in-person conversation. For a lot of kids, they really enjoyed being at home during virtual learning. I know a lot of my clients would wake up and still be in their PJs for their sessions. And there were lots of times I was pretty jealous of them being able to do that. I think a lot of people who were working virtually felt the same way. And so it's just going to be one of those things we all need to overcome. Overall motivation has definitely changed during the pandemic. And it's something we need to think about in regards to internal versus external motivation. We need to find ways to increase motivation any way we can. And we've all been very out of routine, whether that's for work or school, for sports, for clubs, for activities. It's been a big change, but it's not one that we can't get past. So now let's talk about how to increase those protective factors. Protective factors are those things that buffer us against stress. Think about what you do for your health, like maybe trying to eat a balanced diet, exercise, take vitamins, whatever it may be. We do those things so that we can try to prevent being sick. This is the same thing. Protective factors are what's going to help us to prevent getting any sort of behavioral or emotional concern that would get too out of control. We want to increase all these protective factors, such as having a relationship with at least 2 trusted adults, like Maureen mentioned. We want to build that connection to home, school, and community. Some of those questions could be, what are you most looking forward to going back to school? Are you excited to be able to do sports or be in the play again? What about band or chorus? Always make sure you know how to access care for physical and mental health, and don't wait till you need to know how to access it. Think about it ahead of time. My child needed to talk to a social worker, a psychologist, or a counselor. How would I find that person? Do I know how to find them? What would I do? And also think about having some agency, which is the ability to have a sense of control in your own life. That's something we've all lost during this pandemic. Think about how we can help kids regain that. Even little things. Hey, what do you want me to pack for your lunch for tomorrow? Can be a big game changer. Now that we know about some protective factors, let's also think about warning signs. Just like with the Maureen slide with the woman carrying the groceries, this picture was picked for a very important reason. When we hear the little beep from our smoke alarm, we don't wait to see flames before we respond. It's the same thing with warning signs. We want to be on the lookout for things. We want to be on the lookout for items such as physical or somatic symptoms, headaches, stomach aches, feeling tired, physical pains that don't have a medical explanation. Typically, that means that the child or person has got something more in the mental health realm going on. We also want to be aware of students who all of a sudden want to leave school early or are making frequent visits to the nurse. Again, these are warning signs. Pay attention to them before things get much worse. Modeling can really come into play, especially now as we all try and figure things out and look to each other. Think about those ads back in the day with Michael Jordan. Everyone wanted to be like Mike. Your kids also have friends that they want to be like. And if some of those friends are showing some of these warning signs, they may emulate those signs as well. Think about who your kids are hanging out with and be supportive of them and their families as well. Again, let's not wait till these warning signs turn into a bigger issue. Let's get ahead of it. And one of the best ways to get ahead of it is to build a really solid foundation. Just like when you build a house, you really want a strong foundation to build upon. You want to do the same thing for your physical and mental well-being. If you think of a pyramid, you'll think of that triangle pointing up, and there's a really large base at the bottom. It can't be this huge structure without a large, solid base. That's the foundation. When we talk about our sleep, exercise, and nutrition, the important thing here is that we all take small steps in the right direction. People really struggle with some of these things. For example, maybe they don't exercise at all, and then all of a sudden they set a goal of being able to run a marathon or compete in a triathlon or joining some big gym and throwing lots of weights around. That's not necessarily what we're talking about here, because oftentimes those changes are not sustainable. We're really talking about making little changes throughout your day that'll lead to better outcomes. Maybe it's for sleep, putting the phone down a half an hour earlier than you currently are. Maybe for exercise, it's just parking a little bit further away from the grocery store and walking instead of parking as close as possible. And things with nutrition are as simple as maybe one less cookie and maybe one more carrot. Even with these small changes, we can have great outcomes. And we always want to keep in mind the old adage, some is more than none, which we're also going to talk about more. Although we can build the best base ever and create a really strong foundation, there are going to be some challenges that we still are presented with, such as having a child who may not want to go back to school. There's always a small population of students who don't want to return to school. And there's some predictions that that population may increase due to the changes from the pandemic, like we spoke about. Going from being able to go to class in your PJs to having to go face everyone on the first day of school is going to be a huge hurdle for some kids to overcome. So when we talk about these students, a great place to start is by understanding the problem a little bit better. So let's talk about school avoidance. School avoidance is very different from what we consider truancy. Truancy is more of a choice. Think of maybe you had senior skip day when you were in high school, or in my case, senior skip days. That was a choice we made to not go to school. School avoidance is more related to anxiety, worry, concern, stress, and it feels like a lot less of a choice. When we look at the picture of Calvin here, the most powerful word is anything. He would rather do anything than go to school. And if you know Calvin, you know how much he hates eating vegetables, but I think he would even agree that he'd rather eat whatever slimy vegetables his mother cooked up that night than have to go to school. It's really important that we understand the difference between the anxiety-based school avoidance and truancy. And now that we do, we can start talking about solutions and strategies for school avoidance. The best question to ask to try to understand what's going on with the child is, what are they trying to avoid by going to school? Something at school is causing them some level of distress or worry, or maybe it's not at school and it's at home. But if we can figure out what they're trying to solve by avoiding school, we can create some really good solutions. Let's get into some functions of behavior to help better understand this question. I like to break down functions of behavior with the acronym EATS, E-A-T-S, and I remember that because function feeds behavior. EATS stands for escape, attention, tangible, and sensory. When we look at the data on why students miss school, the majority of them miss school because they want some tangible reward, the T in EATS. They get something by not attending school. Maybe it's that they get to play some more Fortnite at home or their other favorite video game. Another large population in the school avoidant group is students who escape stimuli that provoke negative feelings at school. Maybe it's that they're being teased or bullied. Maybe they have a learning disability and really struggle to perform well. And by not going to school, they don't have to face those things. This can also work at home. Maybe they don't want to leave home because they're so attached and they're really struggling to kind of break away from that. So they're trying to avoid having to deal with it. Sometimes we have students who are attention seeking. And a lot of times those students are very good at getting a lot of attention for not attending school. We have to be very careful here to not provide attention for those sorts of behaviors. And lastly, there's some small population that want to escape social evaluation, such as if I avoid school, no one will judge me. If we can always go back to the EATS acronym and really think, is the student trying to escape something? Are they trying to gain attention in some way? Is there some tangible thing they want? Or is there a sensory experience maybe they're trying to avoid? We can really start to understand the answer to the question about why are they trying to avoid school, and then develop better understandings. So we talk about understanding. We must always keep in mind that there are no bad kids. Oftentimes, the behaviors just described are a nonverbal way of communicating. It's a lot easier to maybe act out than to tell your parent you're really struggling in language arts, or you're being teased or bullied because you don't have the same clothes somebody else has. By resisting school, kids can kind of avoid those things without having to talk about it much. So it's really important to see behavior as a way to communicate and not start punishing for those things. In this saying, it says there's no bad kids, but I would also like to add that there are no bad parents. We're all figuring this out 1 minute at a time. And yes, I did say 1 minute, not 1 day, because that's the pace we really need to keep in order to make good progress and not stress out as much as we could be. Let's now talk about stress a little bit more and how school avoidance can occur when stress exceeds support. Essentially, think of it like a seesaw. And if the stress side of the seesaw is the one that's got all the weight on it, that's the side that's going to stay down. If a child does not have the support and resilience, which is the ability to bounce back, the stress will always be the side of the seesaw that's staying down, and that can result in avoiding school. One other way to think about it is with push and pull factors. Pull factors are things that can make students not want to be in school and present non-attendance and overcome the push factors that encourage attendance. Let's look more into ones that keep kids out. So there might be some changes in the family dynamic. Perhaps the child had to take a bigger role in the family because someone has been ill at home, or there's more separation anxiety because we're just not used to the separation like we've had for the past year. There's also been a lot of loss over the course of the last year, not just a loss of people, but also a loss of opportunities. Kids missed out on clubs, activities, sports, birthday parties, all sorts of things. Things that were very traditional and have a long history in our culture were just not possible. There are also push factors to stay home, such as being treated poorly in school, having some challenges with teachers or peers, and academic and learning difficulties. All of these things can result in kids avoiding school, but there's also lots of push and pull factors that can push kids and pull them back into school. So let's talk about those. The key pull factor to go to school is to reduce the anxiety about attending. This can be the child's anxiety and or your anxiety as a parent. For example, my daughter is going to start kindergarten in the fall, and I'm very anxious about it. But by using some of the strategies for self-care that I talked about before, I can manage my feelings and support her. This is also a great example of modeling. If she doesn't see me worrying, she knows that there's nothing to worry about. Studies have shown that there are very excellent treatment outcomes for anxious children when their parents are the ones getting help. If this describes your situation, I'd highly recommend that you look at some of the work from Yale under their SPACE program. That is through their psychological department and talks a lot about how to help yourself parent an anxious child. Push factors are all the things that kids look forward to at school, like clubs, sports, seeing friends, and it can also be academics for kids. Keep in mind that students with trusted adults in school have better outcomes. Speak with your kids about who these people are and make sure that they have access to them. Also, think creatively here. It can really be anyone. I remember working with a student one time who had a really great relationship with the school custodian and would go to school just to be able to hang out and speak with that person. It was a really nice bond that they developed and really helped this child overcome some significant anxiety about attending school, knowing that the custodian would be there in the morning to say hi and check in on their favorite sports teams. It worked out great as an intervention for everyone involved. Now that we understand push and pull factors, let's talk a little bit about being part of a team. When we think about teams, we think how each person on the team has a role, and not any person on the team can do every single part. Think about baseball or football, soccer, basketball, or any other sort of team. Everyone has a position. Teams constantly trade or acquire players to support certain positions. They pull in experts. Say your team doesn't have a very good pitcher. They're going to try and trade for one or buy one or get one in a draft to support the team. Think about who is on your team and your child's team. What roles do they play? How can they be a good teammate? What's your role? How can you be a good teammate? Some key members of the team are the parents, school people, school staff, possibly a private therapist, and also community mental health resources. Again, think about these sorts of things before you need them. It's always good to plan ahead of time. By building teams, we create broad safety nets for children, which helps make sure that there is support in all the environments that they face, and that there's always some safety net for them to fall down on in case they need it. So before, we spoke a little bit about some being more than none. Let's learn more about that. By using this mindset, we can make a lot of great progress and not get stuck. For example, if you're someone that doesn't really like to run, like me, and you set the goal to run 10 miles every day, that would be pretty difficult. However, if I set a goal to maybe start walking a bit a few times a week, and then maybe a light jog in a couple weeks and work up from there, I'll be a lot more successful. I want to keep in mind some is more than none. This is the same with school avoidance. If the child isn't attending school at all, 0 minutes, and they go into school for 1 minute, well, that's a win. Some is more than none. We can think of progress in terms of frequency, how often the child attends school, duration, how long they last in school, and always try to make progress in any of those ways. Keep in mind, progress also isn't typically linear. We may slide back sometimes, and that's okay. What's important is that we're looking for overall progress in the right direction. Think about what Maureen said earlier about perspective as well. That ties in nicely here. I like to use the analogy of a nice slice of watermelon. You have a choice when you look at a slice of watermelon to focus on what you're eating. Some people will focus on the seeds and be really disappointed. They're not very tasty. But a lot of people will also focus on the sweet fruit in front of them. The seeds are small compared to the fruit, but if we focus on them, they can get bigger and bigger. Just keep in mind, let's all focus on the watermelon and not on the seed. We've covered a lot so far, so let's take a minute to pull it all together and talk about getting creative. Look at this picture. Even though the person had a great idea, it will not be used because there's no precedent for it. If we always thought that way, we would often fail. So how can we be creative in working with children struggling to get back to learning? Think about this for a second. If there was a child who unfortunately was wheelchair bound, we'd make lots of accommodations for that child. We would build them ramps. Maybe we'd need to get an elevator installed. We would set times for them to perhaps leave class early so the hallways weren't so congested. We'd figure it out and make things work for them. We can approach children with mental health concerns in the same way. Think about accommodations that they may need. It's really an equal parallel when you think about it. The best way to do this is to get creative. A lot of times, these are things that schools haven't dealt with or have little experience with, or maybe they have a lot of experience, but this child presents a little bit differently. You will always know your child better than anyone else because you're the parent. Think about what makes things work for them and go from there. Even if it's the best plan in the world based on theory or research, that plan is really useless if no one can implement it. So keep that in mind when you're working on designing interventions. A lot of interventions I've created over the years got a lot of pushback initially, mainly for the same reason as in this picture. No one had done it before. I've had kids shift grades, set up whole project-based learning to build a Frisbee golf course in the back of the school. I had a student working to get Christmas presents in July. All of these ideas were creative, and they only really worked because the child bought in and the parents were able to implement the plans. By working creatively as a team, we all strive for success, and oftentimes we're able to reach it. Now, let's check back in with Maureen to hear more about the gifts of the new school year and what we can expect. Maureen?
Thanks, Matt. That was really helpful. I found myself sort of getting so involved in what you were saying and thinking about as a grandparent, how I could implement some of those things with my grandchildren as they get ready for the school year. So you're looking at the title of this and you're saying, what are they talking about? Collective effervescence. What pills are they taking? Well, we want to translate this into English for you because it's such an important concept. And basically what it's telling us is that we get our greatest pleasure and joy in life when we come together for a common purpose. Effervescence, as you probably can kind of think in your head, is all the fizz that comes, from something that you're drinking. The bubbles create that liquid fizz. And in life, we kind of think of that fizz as enthusiasm, excitement, joy. That's what kind of that effervescence is like. You can feel that when, for example, you sing at a church service. I know that I feel it every time we sing the national anthem at a sports event. I just get this kind of sense inside. When you have a family dinner, or you just meet your friends for coffee or maybe for happy hour, there's an energy you get from that. There's kind of a goosebumpy feeling, and it connects you to everything and everyone around you. And what happens with that is you feel part of something that's so much larger than yourself. During the pandemic, if you think back on it, that was pretty absent for most of us, wasn't it? We've got a picture of the Kentucky Derby up there because we know it didn't even happen. As lockdowns and social distancing became the norm, there really were fewer and fewer of these moments for all of us. And instead, we often found ourselves and our kids kind of in a dark cloud. It wasn't even like we were under it. We were sort of in that fogginess. And one of the things we know about emotions is they can be contagious. They're easily spread, just as we know viruses are spread, emotions are spread. Think back, for example, when the pandemic began. The first emotion that spread was fear and panic, wasn't it? And it wasn't limited to face-to-face interaction because we often had very little of that. It spread through text messages and it spread through media posts. I want you to consider the fact now that the world is opening up for all of us, we can now start to spread some positive contagious energy. Take advantage of every opportunity you can to connect socially. Just being around other people, doing the same thing really does produce a kind of joy and happiness we haven't had for a long time. I can't tell you, and again, this is how simple it is. I keep going back to the grocery store because you must think I'm in the grocery store a lot, but think about being in a line in the grocery store for the first time and not having to be 6 feet from the person in front of you and having a conversation about how different it was and knowing that they felt the same way. The other thing I want to suggest to you is that you involve your kids in coming up with ideas for this collective effervescence. Trust me, the idea of being like the bubbles in soda pop is something that kids can really get engaged in. And it's a simple way to introduce some happiness back into your life without having to try very hard. So let's see what we've left you with after we've gone through all of this. We're going to talk about it as wrapping up the gifts. And I know Matt and I have talked at you a lot for almost an hour. So we're going to take just a couple minutes to summarize what we hope are some of the points that you're taking away. First of all, we've all learned some things since the pandemic started, besides living with uncertainty. And it would be great if you could identify what some of those are, both for yourself and for your kids. Life gives us a lot of opportunities to develop perspective. We just have to look for them. One of the most important, I think, perspective skills at a time of crisis is not necessarily to focus on what's positive for us, but really on kind of what are the neutral things that are going on as opposed to the negative. As we said before, it takes less energy to focus on neutral things than it does negative. You know, something neutral may have been, well, I didn't have to worry about going to the dry cleaners because I didn't wear any clothes that needed dry cleaning. I was in my pajamas most of the time. Little things like that. It's kind of a neutral. And as Matt said, you'll never be able to take care of your kids if you don't take care of yourselves first. It's putting that oxygen mask on when you get on the plane. And initially, too, and finally, information is power. Hopefully, Matt gave you a lot of powerful information today. And think about what points really stuck with you. The 2 points that really stuck with me were there are no bad kids and there are no bad parents. I think it's that moving away from the judgment to kind of take things in a more open-minded way. And the second point that I really took away was that some is better than none. We don't need to be 100%. And most likely, most of us are not going to be 100% for the next several months. Whatever number you come up with in your brain is okay for you. And finally, how important that connection is for all of us. We may be sitting in different sections of that same boat, but we're all headed to the same place at the end of the day. And although at times it may feel like it's a perilous journey for us, we all need those moments of joy, connection, and happiness to feel like we're going to get there in one piece. So I would like to thank you all for listening to this. We certainly hope that there's a piece of this that you all take away. And we want to, again, thank you for listening and wish you a really, really good school year. Thank you.